So let's start our analysis of efficiency and government intervention with taxes, so excise taxes in particular. All right, so let's first remember we're going to draw out our market. So price, quantity, we have this upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. These competitive market assumptions hold. This is the Q star, which is allocatively efficient. Here's the P star. So let's say there's a tax of $T. So if we remember, that tax of $T is going to create a wedge of exactly, a tax wedge of exactly that length between buyers and sellers, of that size between buyers and sellers. Remember, if it's on the sellers, it's going to shift our supply curve up by exactly the level of that tax. If it's on the buyers, it shifts it down, the demand curve down by exactly that. But remember, it doesn't matter who the tax is actually on, because who pays the tax depends on elasticity, right? Whoever's curve is more inelastic is going to pay more of the tax. So remember, the top of this tax wedge is the price the buyers pay. The bottom is the price the sellers get. And now we can, and remember, this is the new quantity. So we see that the quantity is going down. So we know we're going to get some inefficiency. All right, so let's think of these different areas on this graph. And let's hope we can get some more colors to work so we can. All right, so the first thing is, let's talk about consumer surplus. So remember, this is below demand, above the price. In this case, the price the buyers pay is PB. So this area here is the consumer surplus. Now, producer surplus is going to be below the price. In this case, PS is the price the sellers get, and above the supply curve. So that's this area here. Now, we briefly talked about it in class, but tax revenue, we're going to assume the government is an efficient spender of tax revenue, take that as you will. And the amount of revenue the government gets is going to be the size of the tax times Q star star, right? How many of these units get sold in whatever market this is. So this area here is going to be that tax revenue. So again, in case it's not obvious, this is consumer surplus, and this is producer surplus. And so we can see that we're just missing one area, and that's this triangle here. And this is the deadweight loss. So this is the difference in efficiency in total surplus. So we're thinking that tax revenue is going to be used efficiently. So it's not part of deadweight loss. This triangle right here is this loss of efficiency that occurs through this tax making a wedge between buyers and sellers and decreasing the quantity exchanged on the market. So this is that loss of efficiency. Remember, if we want to calculate the area here, this is 1/2 base times height is the area of this triangle. So the difference, the size of the tax, is the base of this triangle, and the height is going to be the difference between the equilibrium quantity and this new quantity after the tax. So if you ever want to calculate that, we can use this area of a triangle to do that. Same with consumer surplus and producer surplus, 1/2 base times height to be able to calculate those. And then tax revenue, it's this rectangle, so length times width, right? All right, so here's how taxes are creating this inefficiency in the market. One more thing we should talk about is how elasticity is going to affect this deadweight loss and why governments might want to tax things that have very inelastic demand or supply curves. So here it's kind of a in between. We kind of just drew out these supply and demand curves, but let's draw one with a really inelastic, let's say, demand curve. So here's the supply curve, and then let's have a really inelastic demand curve. So it's really, relatively, I know it changes along this straight line, but a relatively inelastic curve because it's pretty vertical here. So again, this is the efficient quantity. Here's the price. And if we created a tax wedge here, buyers are going to pay the majority of this tax. They're going to have the higher tax incidence. So PB is way up there. It's a big increase for buyers, but sellers are only going to have a little change in the price they get. And now look at what happens to this deadweight loss. Remember, the deadweight loss now is this triangle here. And it's much smaller here than over here because of how inelastic this demand curve is. It'd be small if the supply curve was really inelastic too. And so this is why the government, so deadweight loss is smaller if, or supply, I guess I should say, inelastic. So relatively inelastic, let's say. So the more inelastic it is, the smaller deadweight loss. And if it's perfectly inelastic, there is no deadweight loss because the quantity doesn't change. I guess I should make sure I make it clear the quantity is changing there. Okay, so deadweight loss is going to be smaller. So this is why governments want to tax things that are relatively inelastic. So things like cigarettes and booze and gasoline and things like that, because they're creating less, there's all the reasons why we might want to do that as well, but they're also, efficiency-wise, they're creating less deadweight loss in these markets through government intervention than a market that has really elastic or relatively more elastic curves. It's going to create a bigger deadweight loss because the quantity is going to change more in these elastic markets than when one of the demand and supply or both are inelastic.